Welcome, everybody. We're so glad that you could join us. My name is Jason Dobrlecki, and I'm the director of engagement here at Traction Rec, and I'll be your host today. Um, a few quick housekeeping things before we jump in. One, today's session really more educational in nature. What you're not going to see today is a product demo. We'll certainly reference our systems and workflows, but today's really going to be more about strategy and more of a educational conversation. So we'll include a few polls as we go throughout today to keep this interactive. Please drop questions into the Q&A as we go. We have a few folks from Traction Rec as well as some folks from CampDoc in the chat to answer questions as we go, or to chime in, maybe to relay a question live as well. We'll also save some time at the end to answer any Q&A as we go. A bit about myself, for those that I haven't met. My name is Jason Dobrlecki. As I mentioned, I spent just about 20 years in the YMCA and JCC worlds, doing membership and marketing, and being just a general all-around nerd and techie, working with systems that they all use to run their organizations. For the past 5 years, I've been nearly 5 years. I've been here at Traction Rec, leading our engagement team. That includes our solution engineers as well as our success team. So I spend the bulk of my day working with organizations just like yours around registration strategy, operational readiness, and really how your systems support your staff on a day-to-day basis. So many of you on this call are already leveraging Traction Rec for registrations and operations. Some of you are exploring it as an option. But today is really all about what happens after someone clicks that register button. Dominic, you want to share a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, more than happy to jump in, Jason, and thanks for the kind intro. So, for folks that I haven't had a pleasure to meet yet, my name's Dominic. I'm the director of sales over here at CampDoc, and I've had the pleasure of being here at the CampDoc team for, this feels weird to say, but coming up on 8 years in like mid-March. So, time has strangely flown. Now, prior to leading the sales team, I actually got to spend a number of years serving as our team's primary YMCA and JCC specialist. So, a lot of the names that I see on the attendee list are quite familiar, and it's great to see you all again. So to say that I've learned a lot from this wonderful community and have some great insights from you all to share is probably a big understatement. And we're looking forward to today's conversation. For those of you who are also a little unfamiliar of like what the heck CampDoc is in the first place, why we're bringing in this partner for this conversation, context might be helpful here. So CampDoc is a software that helps camps and youth programs with managing the sensitive information that you always collect from your families. So especially health data, that's kind of like our bread and butter. Our goal is to really help enhance your program preparation and execution strategies. So we offer different solutions to help your teams collect and review and act upon information that you need to really safely and compliantly go about those processes. This way, you can focus on really delivering an exceptional experience while still prioritizing health and safety and efficiency behind the scenes. But that's enough context for one day. As Jason mentioned, we're not demoing anything within today's conversation. We're focusing more so on our topic. Speaking of which, Jason, you want to tee that on up for us?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Dominic. For many of our Traction Rec customers, registration running pretty smoothly. But what we see across the industry is really increasing complexity in what happens next. Youth needs are becoming more and more complex, medically, emotionally, behaviorally. And at the same time, many of your staff are seasonal. They're incredible people, but they're likely not medical professionals, and they may not know your systems inside and out, or as deeply as your full-time professional staff. But the bottom line is they're the ones that are driving experience. They're driving accessibility to your program, and accessibility isn't just physical access; it's preparation. Preparation for all things camp can throw at your staff on a daily basis. And this entire journey wraps up into a parent experience, from marketing to registration, to post-registration forms, to drop off and pick up and daily communications, and ultimately re-enrollment for camp next year. And that's really the core idea that we want to anchor on today. You can't be truly prepared if your data strategy is reactive. So readiness requires the right data to be collected at the right time and in the right place. And those are really the three concepts, the three things that we're going to focus our conversation on today. One, where does this information live? Our second topic is going to be around when should this information be collected and when should it be reviewed? And then finally, how should it be structured so that it actually helps your staff and their ability to serve your campers and your camp families. So we asked a question when you all registered for this webinar. We asked you all, what was your biggest challenge in preparing for camp this season? And about 75% of you, a little bit over 75% of you, responded in one of three categories. And that is that our process works well, but it feels more manual than it should. Some of that comes down to where they're collecting this information. The second was getting the right information from families early enough is where you're struggling. So when you're collecting this information. And then three, helping staff feel confident and supporting campers' needs. So those are really kind of three kind of core concepts that you're going to hear throughout this presentation today. So that brings us to our first kind of topic that we want to anchor around, and that is, where does this information live? And we're going to start it out today with a poll. And you should see this poll popping up, and we're going to give you a few seconds to go ahead and start responding with what is the most appropriate response for you today. Got about half of you responding so far. We'll give it just a couple more seconds. I think we're getting a pretty good feel. I honestly, I'm amazed that there's nobody with paper forms or fillable PDFs. I love that. We've come a long way in the last number of years.
Going to say it's like a
Beautiful.
wonderful surprise here to see the numbers flowing in so rapidly, and yet we're still at zero for paper forms. My goodness.
Amazing. So we've got a pretty good mix. We've got almost half of you that have a dedicated camp solution or other type of a health form. But overall, it's a pretty good mix of all of those options, and that is honestly completely what we expected. What we hear from our customers at Traction Rec is that they either just use Traction Rec for all things camp and childcare, or sometimes they use a secondary system. And we love it when that solution is CampDoc, but that's not always the case today. But when it is CampDoc, we find that secondary system, or sorry, when it isn't CampDoc, we find that secondary system isn't integrated because they don't have an API that enables a two-way communication. And for those that are less technical, that just means that third party doesn't really play well with others. They want to be your sole system for doing all things from discovery to registrations to forms and logistics. And frankly, that can be a little risky. That has negative impacts on your organization's overall user experience because you're splitting out that registration experience into completely different systems. That parent that registered for swim lessons 2 weeks ago is now registering for camp, and it feels completely different and unfamiliar with a completely different set of login information and registration flow. And that system doesn't have all the information that you need either, like their membership status and their outstanding balance or their full family history of registrations and participation with your organization. So having two systems that do what they do best and play nicely together kind of give you the best of both worlds. Camp and childcare are highly specialized programs with very unique needs. And so, Dominic, from your perspective, why might having two systems working in tandem be a better option from CampDoc's perspective?
Yeah, it's a great question, Jason. So, when we often think about the potential benefits of using two different systems side by side, I personally think it's really helpful to ask ourselves one core question that I've heard a lot of others ask, which is what is each system built or designed to do at its core? Because different platforms, they're just built to meet different needs and solve different problems, right? Now, sometimes when we try to force one system to do everything under the sun, we create a little bit of operational and compliance risk, albeit, of course, unintentionally. Now, that operational risk can sometimes be seen when we create some unnecessary friction within a process, and that compliance risk can be seen when we pose that subtle little safety risk. Sometimes both of those types of risks can also exist at the exact same time, and regardless of which situation you might find yourself in, we know that risk is something we want to avoid at all costs. So, when we look at strategies for avoiding risk, that's something that why we recommend a two-system approach. It's really coming back to risk mitigation. So think of it this way, right? Your recreation software, it's probably not built to handle medical records and compliance and privacy regulations, and that's a-okay. There's no need to fit a square peg into a round hole here and potentially create unnecessary risk because of it. Similarly, like Jason mentioned earlier, there are some aspects that you're going to find in a system like a Traction Rec or another recreation software that simply won't be available to you in a camp-focused system. And again, that's a-okay. So, to keep things as simple as possible, we often recommend designating your registration system as that go-to place for managing transactions and leverage a supplementary system that's really truly designed to handle compliance and secure medical documentation. So essentially, we're just circling back to that core question from earlier, right? What is each system built or designed to do and acting accordingly? So, Jason, I'll throw things back over to you. I know you've consulted a lot with teams on really the job of registration, what it's meant to do. And I'd be curious to know from you on how we can use that knowledge to really keep operational risk at an all-time low.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks, Dominic. So from a registration system specifically, the job of registration is really discovery. It's the enrollment into the program. It's the payment. On the staff side, it is the financial tracking, the revenue recognition, the accounts receivable and collections, everything subledger related. On the parent side, they essentially want to secure a spot in camp, right? Or in childcare, a high demand program. They want to secure that spot. They want to give you their money, be locked in with that spot, full stop, right? It should be as frictionless as possible and as customized to that particular parent as possible. Most of our camp families aren't first time customers. They want to feel like you know them and you're providing a bit of a tailored experience for them. And registration is already stressful for parents with wait lists and dates and logistics and pricing. So we should do everything that we can to kind of bring that stress level down and be able to deliver the essential experience of that registration without overloading them with 20 pages of medical forms during the registration process. That increases abandonment rates. Families get frustrated, and your staff spend more time kind of troubleshooting forms than they really do serving families and answering questions about camp during that registration process. So the strategic question becomes, what information do we need at the time of purchase to operationalize this program? And this might be things like staff impacting needs, inclusion indicators, basic alerts on these registrations, but it likely does not include things like full medical histories, complex medication schedules, multi-page behavioral assessments. We can separate out these registration requirements when you have two systems that are playing nicely together. And that's where these intelligent workflows and guided experiences can really help. We can help reduce that friction without sacrificing that insight. Dominic, once registration is complete, essentially when we're dealing with that sensitive health information, what are some recommendations you have on how to best handle, collect, and operationalize that data securely?
Yeah, good question, Jason. So now that we've got our registration complete, right, and our families have a little bit of skin in the game after securing their spot and potentially making a payment, there's actually a ton of great information they can offer us. But before we really talk too in depth about how we handle that data, I want to make sure we step back for a second and clarify what we're actually handling and storing in the first place. You see, we often hear two key acronyms thrown around when we talk about handling sensitive information. PII and PHI. So I think it's often helpful by talking about the difference between the two, as this is pretty critical due to the level of liability associated with each. So, to start things off, let's talk a bit about PII, which stands for personally identifiable information. You can kind of think of this as like business data, right? It's the basics of who someone is and how we reach them. So, some examples of PII might include just basic first and last names, home addresses, email addresses, you name it. And when we think about who needs this data to do their job, we often think pretty broad and wide. So your front desk is going to need access to this information. So does your finance team, your marketing team, and likely your program staff itself. Now, when we contrast that with PHI, so that's protected health information, things start to change a little bit. Whereas we thought of PII as business data, you can think of PHI as care data. This is often the information that we need to best prioritize a child's health and safety while they're in our care. So this is where we start thinking more about medications and dietary restrictions, behavioral health history, and more stuff in that lane. And while PII might be really helpful to be known by a broad number of staff members, oftentimes access to PHI is a lot more limited, perhaps isolated to just your program directors, your nurse, and potentially a specific counselor assigned to each camper. So, what's the point in us actually discussing the difference between the two? Well, the moment we attach any sort of level of PHI to a person's name within a system, that data transforms and it possesses a higher level of risk. So, it needs to be disclosed differently and stored differently and retained differently. There's a lot to it. That's why we often go through the security rigmarole that we do that our wonderful IT teams put in place for us, right? And that means it's important for us to figure out how we can limit our access to this data to mitigate risk as much as possible. Now, one way to mitigate that risk that a lot of IT departments I talk to recommend is implementing a strict compliance firewall, so to speak. The thought here is basically that because PII and PHI carry different levels of risk and are subject to different regulatory rules, well, perhaps it's best to just house them in two completely separate places. Your logic here is pretty simple, right? Different people are going to need different levels of access to different information that is sensitive in nature. So, for example, when a front desk admin is trying to look up a refund, you don't want them to accidentally stumble upon a kid's behavioral health history. And when your camp nurse, if you are working an overnight camp, is trying to triage and try to figure out who next to fit into the camp health center workflow, they should probably not be aware of which one of your families is the biggest donor. So, what do we do then? Well, we aim to keep information on a need to know basis as much as possible. And sometimes, like we referenced earlier, that's going to be most easily executed when the information you need to know lives in two completely separate places. That way, you can allow each system to focus on what it does best and easily administer access to each separate system accordingly. Now, of course, looking at the poll results, we know that also there are some teams out that need that information to live in a singular database, and that's fine too. In that case, what you need to ensure is that you have the proper access controls in place to make sure that not all users have access to the exact same data. So if you haven't talked about it before, this is where role-based permissioning often is super key, right? So you can figure out what roles at your YMCA or EAC are really necessarily accessing certain points of data, such as health data, PII, you name it. So when it comes to handling this data safely, talk to your team and figure out what strategy works best for you. Sometimes that means coming to the realization that your registration system isn't necessarily built to house medical information, and that's fine, right? That's not what it was built for in the first place. Other times it means just realizing you simply need the right controls in place to keep your data under lock and key. But regardless of your approach, remember, you basically have three goals here, right? You want to keep information on a need-to-know basis, you want to ensure you're protecting each family's privacy, and all the while, you also want to make sure you're limiting your organization's degree of liability. And Jason, that's where I throw things back on over to you.
Amazing. So where we collect this information makes a big difference. Registration optimizes our family's experience and operations. Health systems optimize safety and compliance. And when each system kind of stays in their lane and does what they do best, your families and your staff both win. So this moves us on to our second of three topics, and that is going to be when to collect information, when we should collect this information to avoid blind spots. And this moves us on to our second poll, which you see popping up on your screen now. So when do you typically review detailed camper health information. We'll give you, again, a few seconds to go through and select the most appropriate response for your organization today.
This is one where I'm so curious, Jason, to see what the responses look like. I feel like I've talked to different organizations who have checked every single one of these boxes. So I know we have a couple more choices than normal, but truthfully, I'm genuinely curious to see where things shake out here.
A week or two before program start, man, taking the lead.
Alrighty, y'all. Well, I'm happy to go ahead and discuss these poll results. As we kind of referenced there, right? I know we put quite a few choices into that poll, but we put them there intentionally, as we've heard every single response mentioned by one organization or another that we've consulted with. And frankly, they all have their advantages and drawbacks. So for today's conversation, we want to focus on what's likely to get you the most advantageous outcome. Remember, pros and cons to each and every one of these. But at this point, we've already established that we don't need all of a child's information the exact second they register for camp, right? There is indeed an element, though, of time criticality at play when it comes to collecting and reviewing all the information you need before camp starts. So, the main idea I want to share with you here is that if you wait until check-in in particular to start reviewing information, you're going to be doing yourself a great disservice because in doing so, we're creating what we call a blind spot. But what exactly do we mean by that? And what tends to happen when teams don't review this information a little bit further in advance than they'd like? Well, waiting until arrival day in particular can lead to some interesting surprises, to say the least. And oftentimes, these are situations you don't want to be dealing with when you're surrounded by all the other chaos involved in day one of a program. So let's unpack what this means a little bit. You see, the types of surprise you're likely to encounter on check-in day is going to depend on what things look like for you prior to check-in day, right? So for instance, let's say your families usually fill out forms on paper or on a fillable PDF on your website, right? And you see them for the very first time, your staff is finally reviewing them for the first time at check-in. In this case, your staff is going to be rapidly scanning through this information when people do arrive on site. And there are a few key items that can often catch us off guard. First is the one that it looks like you all avoided by staying away from paper, which is great, right? We've moved away from illegible handwriting. That way we don't have to decipher what's actually being written. So that's step one. Step two that we often look at is incomplete information. This is one I hear about all the time, right? We're missing either a few lines of data, maybe a whole page of information, and we need to decide what we actually do about it while we're on site. And last but not least, this is something new too, information that's maybe a little bit out of the norm. So perhaps a child with more complex medical needs than our staff are used to handling, or even a kid whose activity limitations don't align super well with their specific camp schedule. And as many of you know, many of those surprises also don't go away when we stop using paper, right? They prevail in different ways. And these costs of the late discoveries, well, they're plenty. And in a worst case scenario, can result in a mix of unnecessary staff stress, last minute refunds, a break in family trust, or even reputational risk, which is all what we're hoping to avoid here. So, one scenario that I want to bring up that I've heard a couple too many times is what happens when a child arrives with needs that we simply can't meet? Needs that we might have known about in advance, but just simply didn't this time around. Well, if we turn that child away at the door, we're going to hit on all four of those costs we talked about, right? Staff is going to be stressed out, and that's not great on day one when they're trying to focus on other initiatives. Two, family trust and reputational risk could be a jeopardy here. But also, what's important is that depending on your policies, we could see some financial implications, just based on if we need to issue a last minute refund. We might not get another camper in that spot to fill that void. All that to say, this isn't the sort of start that we want to a new program. And thankfully, there are quite a few strategies we have to help you avoid that. So, Jason, this is where I turn things back to you. For teams that are already running a strong registration process in Traction Rec, how do they typically manage families who delay completing their forms, regardless of when we want to review them?
Yeah. So we have a few concepts and features that we use to manage this. So we highly encourage, just like I mentioned earlier, getting those questions out of the way of a parent really securing their spot and handing you their money, right? Make it easy for them to give you their money and secure that spot in camp or in a childcare program. So the fewer the questions that get in the way of that credit card or ACH, the better. But once they hit pay now, that's kind of where the fun begins, right? First step is setting very clear expectations. So, an immediate confirmation email, or better yet, a text message. We know in today's world, not everybody reads their email, but you send them a text, they are seeing that message right away. But that email or text with next steps and a clear timeline is critical. You have to communicate why you need the form early and how they can be completed, and make that next step of actually completing it simple as well. In Traction Rec, we have a few tools available to do this. We can, like I said, get that form out of the way of the transaction. So immediately after the transaction, we can send them an email or a text message that says, "Hey, here's where you need to complete your form." And you have some controls over how long they have to fill that out. So maybe right after the transaction, they have 14 days to complete it, or a month after the transaction, or maybe regardless of when they register, you want to give everybody a hard cutoff. So maybe May 15th is that hard cutoff. So whether they register in January or in April, they all have the same deadline of May 15th. From there, we encourage folks to set up a countdown dashboard. And this is valuable whether you're doing it in Traction Rec or in CampDoc, right? A countdown dashboard that tells you how many registrations you have and how many still have outstanding forms remaining, so that staff can work on bringing that number down to zero as early as possible, and definitely before the start of camp. And even as we're managing that countdown, there's really two concepts to think about, and manage to. There's a difference between a family that is slowly filling out a form, and clicking save as. Maybe they've added their like emergency contacts and they click save, and they come back a few days later, and then they're going to add their doctor's information, and they're going to come back later and add the additional information that they needed to go hunt down, versus that family that hasn't even started the form. And you probably need a very different communication process with each of those audiences, right? A very supportive and encouraging message for those that have started the process and still, are kind of going slowly through to get it all done, versus those that haven't even bothered to open it and start a form. Probably might need a little bit more aggressive communication of, "Hey, you got to remember, you got to fill this out before your kid comes to camp." So that continuous visibility, regardless, though, allows you to triage early. Allows you to have continuous follow up. Encourage your staff, incentivize your staff to work those numbers down and to get them all completed before camp starts. And all of this leads to just smarter staffing decisions, because we have that information early and we can make sure that we're prepared and ready for all of those kiddos that are coming our way and what their individual needs might be. So data shouldn't appear for the first time on day one. It shouldn't be a surprise to us. It should inform our hiring. It should inform our staff ratios and our training. And when you review this information, really determines whether you are taking a proactive or a reactive stance to this data. And that leads us to our third topic for today, and that is really around how this data should be collected and how it should be structured. And that leads us to our third and final poll. When was the last time you reevaluated your camper forms? Again, we'll give you a few seconds on this one here. They're trickling in fast and furious. And Dominic, I'll let you kind of do an evaluation here and take this poll.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So I was going to say we're sharing out the results. Fantastic. We actually have a really mixed bag here, which is fascinating. I will say it's really interesting for myself working with so many different types of organizations over the years to watch how different types of organizations are trending in terms of reviewing their forms. In conversations oftentimes that my team and I are having nowadays, we find that many organizations out there really have gotten into the habit in the past couple of years in particular of just copying and pasting last year's forms more often than not. So I love seeing this variety of some folks saying, listen, I reviewed things this year. Other folks that are saying, I'm not sure. It's been a little while. Well, I will say though, is that we've often seen that leaning a little too heavily on what worked for you just 1 year ago may actually hold you back the following year. I mean, if we take a step back for just a second and think about how much camp itself changes year over year, season over season, right? Not to mention how much the kids we're serving also change over time. It's easy to see how the forms we use to prepare for camp, when tweaked in just the right way, can provide us with a window of opportunity into learning new and insightful information. In other words, relying on the same forums year over year prompts your teams to normalize the items that could lead to problems down the road when left unaddressed, as well as neglect what could be some fantastic opportunities for improvement to drive strategic changes. Now, one of the best areas for improvement that we often see is what we refer to as data overload. And this is where staff are simply drowning in a sea of information, most of which may be actually a little too vague to take action on. So, Jason, I know that you work with teams all the time in reviewing all sorts of different workflows. From your perspective, what does data overload look like from an operational standpoint?
Yeah, thanks for that. When people hear the word overload, they immediately tend to think volume, right? The volume of information that they have coming their way. But from our experience, it's not typically a volume issue at all. It's more of a quality issue. Even if you're getting the information, it has to be information that you can actually operationalize and use. And here's what I mean by that. We occasionally see things like open-ended fields, questions that are like, "Do you have any allergies?" Or "Is there any additional information we should know?" People fill it out, and you get great information, but you get an essay, right? You get a lot of information and a lot of verbose responses, and staff are left to interpret medical nuance through all of that. And how serious is this allergy? Did staff read the paragraph thoroughly enough to understand that, in their second and third more serious allergies were actually in the fourth sentence of that paragraph out of 7 or 8, right? Did they actually read through all of it and interpret it? Even worse, even worse than those vague questions and verbose responses are large numbers of document uploads. When you require someone to, it requires someone to manually read and validate every one of those documents, and they're not reportable. The data's not structured. The risks to all of this is vague answers and hesitation, over under reactions. It's all time sensitive, and a better approach is really structured data. So instead of something like any allergies, you want to ask something like, here, what are your allergies? And we actually have a list so that people can select maybe a multi-select pick list there. Having a reaction type. So again, they can select how severe their reaction is. Severity, providing an actual scale for severity. Maybe something like risk of anaphylaxis. It should just be a yes or a no question, right? There should be no ambiguity to that whatsoever. Requires EpiPen, a checkbox, right? No ambiguity. And then use conditional logic. So smart branching. Healthy campers get short forms. Complex campers get a deeper, more complex form. But at the end of the day, clear data creates data that we can operationalize and use and provide for our staff who can confidently act on that data. One question that we do hear through all of this, Dominic, is if we don't administer medication, do we really still need to collect all of this information? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, Jason, if I had a nickel for probably every time I was asked that question, I'd be a very rich man at this point. So, in terms of asking the medication question, I often like to go back to very wise words that some of my wonderful folks in the YMCA community say to me all the time, which is, you'd always prefer to have information and not need it versus need it and not have it, right? Now, for medications in particular, here is why we say that. Knowing what medications a child is on, as well as knowing whether or not they're actually taking those medications at your program, is going to be able to provide you insights as to how the child is acting on the day of camp. This has become actually really important in the past couple of years in particular, when we've seen a rise in parents leaning into a new trend that we are hearing as a medication vacation while at camp. You all might be familiar with this topic. I hope that you're not, but if you are, you're not alone. Essentially, here, this is where medications suddenly are skipped while folks are at camp because we are acknowledging that camp is often an exciting time for kids to try new things, get out of their comfort zone. But of course, when this idea applies to medications, it can lead to some dangerous outcomes. So, to help avoid this, it's often recommended to cover your bases and, yes, collect medical information like medications even if you don't administer them, just to gain those additional insights into your campers. But like you mentioned, though, Jason, I think the information that you really want to know is what you want to structure your questions around accordingly. So for medications, for example, you want to specifically ask about all medications a child is taking, why they're taking them, and which of those medications will be physically taken while at camp as well. While you're at it, we also recommend clearly laying out your policies to families to set expectations accordingly. So we're going back to one of our earlier topics, right? Expectation setting is key. So if you don't administer medications at camp, that's okay. Just explicitly call that out in the same place you're collecting your medication data. So, long story short, I'm happy to answer the question with a resounding yes, please collect medication information. It is super helpful for you. And for anyone out there looking for guidance regarding exactly which questions to ask or not ask here, we do recommend feel free to reference resources like the American Camp Association and Alliance for Camp Health for guidance. They are always great for tips and tricks there.
Medication vacation. That's a new one for me. That's sounds a little scary. So thank
Terrifying,
you
to
for
say
that.
the least.
Thank you for that, Dominic. So let's wrap this up. So we've talked about where we collect information and the critical nature of that. To optimize registration for the parent's experience, making it easier for a parent to lock in their spot and just make their payment, segregating health data for compliance. We talked about when to collect information. So don't wait for 100% completion before you're making that ask and encouraging people to fill it out. Have reports and dashboards ready to manage to encourage staff and reward staff for early completion and motivate them to follow up and get that information in early. Build continuous visibility into those statuses across your organization. And finally, we talked about how to collect this information. So structured questions reduce risk, remove interpretation, and remove burden from our seasonal staff. So the last thing I want to bring your attention to here is I want to encourage all of you to take the information that we have shared today and conduct a bit of your own readiness audit for your camp and your childcare programs, and ask yourself, are we collecting the right data at the right time? Are systems optimized for what they need, for what they do best? Are our forms structured for action and not essays? And a safe and secure and accessible summer doesn't start in June. It doesn't even start in February. It starts with a data strategy and design while it's still cold out, November, December, and preparing us for that registration period, that those plans take place before that ever even starts. So on your screen, we've got a QR code. We'll take you to a camp and childcare page on our website where it outlines some of these things. Also talks about our wonderful integration with our great partners over at CampDoc. So would encourage you to scan that and have a look through it. And again, if you have anything that you want to follow up with us directly, our contact information is on the screen. We'd love to chat with you some more. So thank you everybody for joining and have a wonderful afternoon.